Welcome back. I am Mr. Sesotris, and this week I wanted to talk to you about modernism. It's one of my favorite kind of eras in literature, and there's some really cool stuff there, and it's kind of a short-lived era compared to a lot of other things. If you look at like postmodernism, that went for a really long time, and if you look at like romanticism, that went for a pretty long time as well. But modernism was sort of this weird stepping stone between kind of eras, and there's some cool stuff that came out of it. Now, first off, I wanted to just define what modernism is, and it's really hard to do that. Modernism is bizarre in that you can kind of see what it's reacting to, and if you place it in relief to the stuff that comes after it, you're like, oh yeah, okay, that's different. But it's kind of hard to say. So we're gonna start with this line from, this is the Cambridge Companion to Modernism, which I refuse to get rid of because it was expensive and I got it for college and I'm going to keep it. Modernist literature is often concerned with the question of how to live within a new context of thought or a new worldview. And that quote kind of gives us a good starting place. Because the thing with modernism is, if you go back to kind of romanticism in the 19th century, everyone was very confident that like everything made sense. The world was ordered, you've got nature, and nature was balanced and good, and then you've got society and civilization. The British Empire was bringing civilization to other lands, and it was a very confident time. Now, there was stuff going on, especially like the Industrial Revolution in England, which sort of changed a lot of things, and a lot of the romantics were sort of reacting to that and being like, no, nature is where the answers are because everything's awful in the cities. But modernism was very much a reaction to a couple different things. There was a few people who sort of got people thinking in new ways. Charles Darwin was one. His concept of evolution kind of upended the sort of Christian worldview of like a perfect created world instead of a world where things just kind of happen as a natural process and change over time. Things weren't like immutable from the beginning. And Marx was another one. Karl Marx, because his concept of sort of basically, it's like everyone is living their lives according to a false narrative of how economics works and kind of where the power is and all that kind of stuff. And so it's not really the people in charge who are actually have all the power, it's the workers, because the workers are the ones who actually do the work, and they're the ones that actually have the power in the situation. And he had the kind of class conflict thing. And then we've got Freud, Sigmund Freud, who came along and kind of said that like the mind isn't like a perfectly ordered thing. And then you've got the concept of like the subconscious and the unconscious. And the mind sort of isn't always in control of itself. There's kind of elements of it that sort of act on their own, and so sometimes people can behave irrationally, and that's a normal thing. It's not the result of demons. It's not the result of some kind of outward imbalance. It's just sometimes people do things or believe things because of traumas and because of experiences and all that kind of stuff that they had kind of growing up that shaped how their mind worked. And everyone's mind works differently. That was another big thing. And so that really shook people up. It was just kind of a weird time for people. World War I also kind of happened at the beginning of 20th century, and that was seen as kind of a huge failure of kind of order, like the normal order of things. It really shook people to their core. And so in the years between kind of the late 19th century and the early 20th century, you have a lot of people who are losing faith in like institutions and losing faith in like this concept of, well, this is the way we've always done things because it's correct. And people started asking themselves, okay, if those ways of doing things don't work, then we can kind of do whatever we want. And there was this kind of quest for sort of a new way of doing things, a new way to organize the world, a new way to conceptualize things, a new lens through which to kind of see the world. And so this is where you get lots more experimentation in art. Modernism is when you see things like cubism show up. And in music, this is where you see things like dissonance and atonal music show up. I'm thinking of like Stravinsky, his Rite of Spring. And by the way, there's this thing going around that like when Stravinsky's Rite of Spring first premiered, it caused a riot. That story is sort of apocryphal. The riot was the result of, it was a concert performance of the music, and people were just very, they reacted strongly to it, but it wasn't necessarily a riot. It was just a really strong audience reaction to a concert production. It wasn't the ballet itself. So, you know, look into that. But the Rite of Spring is really atonal and angry and aggressive, and it plays with musical form. If you look at music from like the 19th century, you've got like Beethoven, who was very much, he was kind of straddling the realm from like classical music to romantic music, and you can see that in his symphonies. But his stuff was always very much romantic, even though it was groundbreaking and it was changing things. It was still very much romantic music. When you get to Stravinsky, and Gershwin's also in this as well, and Mahler and all that kind of stuff, but you've got music that sort of says, all right, these are the rules for how you do something. What if we just didn't follow the rules and made our own rules? And so, you know, you've got the ballet Rite of Spring, which is really aggressive and angry, and it's not like traditional ballet at all. This is not Swan Lake. And depending on how it's performed, it can be very different, but it's very guttural and primal and kind of angry and ugly, but in a you know, intentional way. And so anyways, that's music. We won't go into that, but we're looking at books. So novels and poetry. And so in literature, you see a lot of other stuff happening. This is where you get things like the stream of consciousness novel, and you've got this concept of like making references to previous works that are kind of considered like part of the canon, and like tearing them apart a bit and saying like, can we take these apart and reassemble them into kind of a new way of doing things? And so the whole modernist thing is all about like, what if we just smash the old ways of doing things to bits and then use the bits to build something new? Now the problem is that no one could agree on what that new thing was, but they all assumed that there was a new way of doing things. They were all kind of working towards kind of a new concept of everything, if that makes sense. No one was kind of like, they hadn't given up completely. They just said, we don't have a lot of faith in the old ways of doing things, so we want to make new inroads and find a new way of doing things. But they kind of assumed that there was going to be kind of an order to things. They just had to figure out what that new order was. And that's why, you know, modernism didn't last super long, and it kind of went into postmodernism, where postmodernism is all about subjectivity, and it's like everything's different, and there is no one way of doing things because everyone's minds are different. But that's postmodernism, that's different. And so a good way to do this is to start with T.S. Eliot's amazing poem, The Wasteland. Now, before I read The Wasteland, I'm going to read the beginning of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, because it's important. And, you know, bear with me. My Middle English is not great. My focus was on modernism, and so I only really studied this a couple times. So bear with me, but I'm going to read the first few lines of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. And this is kind of a lighthearted, fun piece. And I'll give you kind of a translation of what it's saying afterwards, but you can kind of get a gist of it. Okay. All right. The general prologue. Juan that April with his shortest sota, the drucht of March hath pierced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liqueur, of which virtue engendred is the flour. Juan Zephyrus eke with his sweete breath, inspired hath in every holt and heath. The tendre croppies and the youngy son hath in the ram his half coursey run, and smalle fowles maken melodie that slepen all the nicht with open ear. So pricketh hem nature and here courages, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages. Okay, that was bad, but anyways, moving on. So, what it's basically saying is like in April, when, you know, everything's nice and, you know, the birds are singing and, you know, the dew is lovely and the wind is sweet and warm and everyone is happy and positive, the thing that people want to do is go on pilgrimages. Now, he's making a joke there because obviously when you read all that, you assume that he's going to say people fall in love. You know, it's like in the springtime when everything is nice and lovely, people want to fall in love. But until he's like, people obviously, clearly go on pilgrimages, right? Because he's a goofball. Because it's Chaucer, it's comedy. But, so I'm reading that, and now I'm going to read you the beginning of T.S. Eliot's The Waste Land. And this is the first section called The Burial of the Dead. All right, so listen to this. And this isn't in any accent, so it's good. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. All right, so I'm just going to read that first little bit. So, obviously, okay, so if you look at the way that this is written, it is written like epic poetry. Like it looks like that, right? And he's taking that kind of fun, you know, April is lovely and sparkly and everything's fun, and showing that like things are not good. There's this kind of description of kind of a dying land and things are falling apart and the kind of old assumptions and the old ways of doing things are being forgotten and lost, and it's kind of apocalyptic. The whole thing about The Wasteland is it's sort of based on this concept of like the Fisher King, which is like a King Arthur story. And what it is, it's sort of, you got this man who's tied to the land and he's wounded fatally or in a big way. He's wounded, and they have to find a way to heal him because the land is tied to the king. And so when he's hurt, the land is hurt and everything's kind of dying and crops are dying and things aren't good. And so in The Wasteland, and it's basically, it's kind of a book of memes if you think about it, because the whole poem, it's like a 5-part epic poem, but it's filled with like quotes and references to other stuff. There's Shakespeare and there's Wagner operas and everything. Like it's just, there's references all over the place. Every few lines is a reference to some classic work of literature. And it's kind of this journey towards kind of this crumbling world where people are lost, and there's kind of images of like urban landscapes of people that are kind of tragic and aimless, and it kind of ends in this kind of triumphant new way of doing things because there's the narrators have kind of come to a new consensus. So that's The Wasteland, and it's kind of weird, but it's a good way to kind of look at how they were viewing things under modernism. So that was a really rough, quick intro to The Wasteland, but I would highly suggest this. It's an epic poem, and it's really fun to just read aloud. It's not long by any means. Let's see, the whole thing is like that. Like it's just a few pages. It's not, when I say epic poem, it's not like a massive thing. So it's just a few pages, but it's 5 parts. Each is very different, and it kind of shows this, there's lots of different characters and there's lots of different settings, and it goes from modern to ancient, and there's just this concept of everyone is kind of searching for a new way of doing things. And so you see that a lot in modernism. Now that's poetry. If you're also interested in other modernist poets, you can check out Ezra Pound is another one. I really like William Butler Yeats. His stuff is very cool because, oh, here comes the kitty. He kind of transitions from a romantic writer to a modernist writer, but even in his early stuff, you can see stuff of modernism. There's the kind of the sense of like Irish folklore and myth and the past, and then as his work kind of matures over time, you see more stuff about like things falling apart, and that's a quote from one of his things. You know, things fall apart. That was the title of a book by Chinua Achebe. But the title comes from, yes, I know, the title comes from Yeats, and so that's where you get like, you know, things fall apart, the center cannot hold, you know, the thing about the falcon, can't listen to the falconer anymore. So there's this kind of sense of disconnect, basically. But I wanted to give some suggestions for some other modernist novels that I know seriously likes modernism too. So one of which is A Passage to India by E.M. Forster. This is a really interesting one. It feels like it should be a romantic book, but there's this concept of like, we can't know. So there's an event that happens near the beginning of this, and we don't see this event, but it's implied that it's an assault of some kind. But it may not have been. And so you've got kind of all these people, they're in India, they're kind of out of their element, because it's all English, you know, white people. They're kind of out of their element, and they're in this unusual place, and there's kind of this concept of like, well, we know what everything should be like. They're confronted with a situation where they can't know for sure what happened. No one has any details, no one has any facts. They're all kind of disconnected from the reality of the event that happened. Even the reader is, because we don't really know what happened. It's really vague and there's no details. And so you've got kind of this group of people who are all trying to figure out what's happening, but they don't have any information. And so you've got this kind of breakdown of sort of assumptions, and this breakdown of the ways of doing things, because people are so confident that they know how to do everything, and then they find a situation where they can't. And so that is really great. Forster is wonderful. I love him so much, and his work is really interesting. Another one, and this isn't really surprising, but that's The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. This one is another one. It's very much like a realist, you know, or like a realistic novel. But it's so open to interpretation. Like, things are really vague, and the symbolism in it is kind of uncertain. English teachers love to teach this as though there's like only one way to read it and only one way to interpret it, and that's really not correct. There's lots of different ways to interpret this, and different lenses through which you can view this. The story, okay, sorry, the cat is shaking the video because she's just obsessed, and she can't stop. So anyways, this is it's one of those ones where it's very deceptively realistic. And so the concept of like the way high society functions, again, you see this kind of breakdown of kind of the normal order of things. So you've got this empty world where kind of the rich and powerful don't know everything, and they don't find happiness, and everything is sort of falling apart. So the thing about The Great Gatsby that's really interesting is that it's set in a time where at the time the general public believed things were doing really good. It was, you know, the war was over, everything was back to normal, so to speak. People were wealthy, people were happy, and Fitzgerald really wanted to kind of deconstruct that a bit and show a situation that kind of allowed a look into kind of how hollow and empty this kind of consumerist sort of world was. And obviously the 20s weren't very lengthy, because it careened into the Great Depression pretty soon after. So it was a period of disillusionment with kind of the old ways of doing things, because people were just like, oh, we're just going to keep doing what we were always doing, and there's some things that were changing, but for the most part, we're just going to assume that everything's fine, when in reality something needed to change, and this is kind of what this is all about. So again, you got that breakdown. This is also a good time to mention jazz. Jazz was a really big part of kind of the modernist world, because it was music that was based on kind of improvisation, and there was no one version of a song ever. It would have been different every time a group played, or if another group played the same song, they could do their own spin on it. And so it was kind of, and jazz itself is very very codified. There's lots of kind of tenets of jazz, and so it's sort of, jazz itself is kind of like it's own worldview that was very different from kind of previous musical traditions, but in itself it was kind of reacting to kind of form and structure and finding new things. A jazz song is like, if you take a traditional standard song, like a folk song or something, and you did a jazz version of that, it's like the jazz is finding the song in between the notes of the original song. It's like, it's deconstructing the original, it's taking it apart, it's finding new meaning, fleeting meaning, kind of in new interpretations of it. And so that's very much what modernism was doing. Another good example is William Faulkner. Now, Faulkner was more in the 30s, but I think in the American tradition, I think modernism lasted a little bit longer. I think in England and Europe, you see postmodernism show up kind of sooner. I think you'd say postmodernism kind of shows up in like the late 30s, the 40s. Basically World War II, was kind of where postmodernism sort of came from. But in America, you do see modernism kind of holding on in the 30s. And so this is a really good example of a book where the plot itself isn't as important as kind of the moments. And so you've got this book where it's a story of like, it's a family, like a rural family, and they're burying their dead mother? Yeah. And they're just taking, traveling to bury her, and there's all kinds of mishaps along the way and whatnot. The thing with this book is that it's not really about the overall journey. It's not like, an adventure story where they face various obstacles as they get to their thing. It's really about kind of how their world has been changed by this event. And so each chapter is narrated by a different person, and so we get different viewpoints, and the kind of overall plot is kind of like an Odyssey type thing, where they're on a journey and there's a goal and everything, but it's not really about the goal. It's about the thoughts going through everyone's mind as they feel lost and uncertain about the future and confused about things. And there's one particularly memorable part that involves concrete. I won't go into any more spoilers, but it's both funny and tragic. In fact, the person who owned this book before me, I got this at a used bookstore. They wrote occasional notes in the margins, just here and there, and I don't know where it is. I'll never find it. But they just wrote in the margins like, "Oh," because this person undergoes something pretty rough. But so this is another good example of that. You see this in other stuff that Faulkner wrote. Obviously, I really like him, but like The Sound and the Fury, I've talked about that before. And Light in August is another one, although that one that one feels like it could maybe be moving towards postmodernism, but it is still kind of a modernist sort of novel. Another good example is Virginia Woolf. I love Virginia Woolf. And I've talked about her book Mrs. Dalloway in the past, and so I wanted to pick another one of hers that I've read that I really like. And this is To the Lighthouse. And again, this is sort of, the plot isn't what's important. This is very stream of consciousness. It jumps heads, so you're inside different characters' minds. And it's kind of more about people reacting to things rather than acting towards something. Because it's just a family kind of on vacation in Scotland. And it's kind of a rocky area, and there's a lighthouse and everything. But you just kind of see this family sort of dealing with trauma and being distanced from one another and feeling cut off from the world and just kind of being uncertain. And there is kind of this suggestion in here that there's a way out somewhere. There's a way for them to come together, but they're not really sure what that is. And so that's another really big thing about this modernism. Like, modernist worldview is this whole, like, we don't know what is going on, but we do know there's something we should be working towards. We just need to find it. But this is really wonderful. It's beautifully written. It's really engaging. And there's kind of the specter of World War I kind of in the background of all of this. And so that's another really interesting one. Finally, I wanted to talk about one that this is a modernist novel, but a lot of people will call it a romantic novel, and that's Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. Now, this is like 1899, so it's like right in that, it's kind of like on the cutting edge. Oscar Wilde was always on the cutting edge of everything, so he's, you know, I don't doubt that he is a trendsetter. But you can tell this is a modernist novel because of the preface. He wrote this preface, and it kind of, it's basically, it gives you things to think about while you're reading the book. Now, I'm just going to read the first and last lines of the preface, so you can kind of get a feeling for kind of what he's doing here. So the first line is, "The artist is the creator of beautiful things." Okay. The last line is, "All art is quite useless." So, the book is kind of gothic. It's kind of a horror novel. You've got this person who he pledges his soul to the devil or something, and he has this painting done of him, and the painting kind of collects all of his sins. Yes, I know. The painting collects all of his sins and his bad deeds, and so the painting gets gross and vile, and you know, the painting ages, but Dorian Gray himself doesn't age, and in the process he gets more and more paranoid about this kind of perfect existence that he has, and it ends up, you know, destroying a lot of people's lives. Very, very good. I love this book, but it's that preface that really makes me see this as a modernist novel. And this isn't an original idea. This isn't something that I just figured out. You know, when I took a class in modernism in college, this was the first book we read, and it was very much set up as kind of an intro. But you've got this concept of, like, you know, we know how everything works and functions, and art is this elevated thing, and art is meaningful, and it's communing with divine forces to tap into things that are important to the human existence. But in reality, you know, art is also a commodity, and art doesn't really have to have a divine purpose. Art can just be fun, and art can just be entertainment. And that's kind of what he's getting at. It's very much like consumerism and everything. There's a particularly memorable chapter in this one, chapter 11, where he just goes on this like buying spree, and he just buys everything, and he collects everything, and he has everything commissioned, and it's just very vacuous and kind of empty, because like no matter how much stuff he has, he's never happy, and so he's constantly just getting more and more stuff. And that's very much a modernist thing. It's this concept of, like, you know, consumerism and you know, the high ideals kind of get replaced with sort of cheap commodities and things. And that's what Fitzgerald's talking about in The Great Gatsby too. But this is a really kind of interesting book in that genre. Maybe not genre. I wouldn't say modernism is a genre, but it is kind of an era of literature, and it's an interesting one. So I'm going to leave it at that because I could ramble about this forever. I've already rambled too long. But modernism is very much about breaking things down and rebuilding them as something new, or trying to find a way to rebuild them into something new, because there has to be kind of a new way of doing things. And so there's lots of really cool literature that came from this era. And there's a lot more authors. If you want something really bizarre that will break your brain, because I don't know, I think everyone should read that. I would suggest Gertrude Stein's The Making of Americans, because it's almost unreadable. Like, I don't read this to be like, oh, you know, if you just read hard enough, you can understand it. It's unreadable. It's very strange, and like even the sentence structure, just it seems like it goes nowhere, and it's very much it's a stylistic reaction to things, but it's just chaos. Another one is James Joyce. His stuff veers kind of wildly. I love James Joyce, but Ulysses is a freakishly disgustingly difficult novel to get through. It's bizarre. I did read it. I don't think I understood it as well. It's really the kind of book you have to like study. You can't just read it for fun. But if you are interested in Joyce, I would suggest A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, because that one, it's shorter and it's kind of easier to get into, and it kind of shows the journey of a character who's trying to figure out what his worldview is, and so he tries on different things, and so he tries to be this and he tries to be that, and it doesn't work, and he's kind of on a quest to kind of figure out himself, and it's funny at times, it's tragic at others, but it makes you think, and it's really stylistically done, and so that one's really cool. Joyce is great, but like Ulysses and even like the Dubliners, I would say read those in a classroom or like in a book club or something where you can discuss it and analyze it and have someone who understands the text there, so they can kind of point out certain things, because it's very Irish, it's very tied into Irish history and Irish culture, and if you're not familiar with any of that, it's like there's certain like references and things that are going to feel a little lost. But Joyce is great. And so with that, I'm going to let you go. Modernism is a ton of fun, and I'm very passionate about it, but I know it can be kind of weird because a lot of modernist stuff is experimental and strange, and it's not really concerned with like realism or even plot. It's more about style and breaking with convention to kind of find new ways of doing things. And so that's what I really like about it, but it can be kind of tricky to some people. I found it completely frustrating when I first read anything modernist, aside from maybe Dorian Gray, because, you know, you can at least kind of follow that. But some of these other ones, I read them the first time, and I was like crying into my hands. I was like, I don't understand this. But once you kind of figure out what it's doing and kind of unhook your brain a little bit, then it's a ton of fun, and there's a lot of cool stuff there. So with that, I'll let you go. I will see you next week. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.